Let's take a look. Daniel 4:10. This is Daniel now interpreting a dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, well, this is Nebuchadnezzar first, relating the dream. Now the visions of my head upon my bed I happened to be beholding, and look, a tree in the midst of the earth, the height of which was immense. The tree grew up and became strong, and its very height finally reached the heavens, and it was visible to the extremity of the whole earth. Its foliage was fair, and its fruit was abundant, and there was food for all on it. Under it the beasts of the field would seek shade, and on its boughs the birds of the heavens would dwell, and from it all flesh would feed itself. Verse 13, I continued beholding in the visions of my head upon my bed, and look, a watcher, even a holy one, coming down from the heavens themselves. He was calling out loudly, and this is what he was saying to Nebuchadnezzar in his dream. Chop the tree down, and cut off its boughs, shake off its foliage, and scatter its fruitage. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its boughs. Verse 15, however, leave its root stock in itself in the earth, even with a banding of iron and of copper. Among the grass of the field and with the dew of the heavens, let it be wet. And with the beast, let its portion be among the vegetation of the earth. Let its heart be changed from that of mankind, and let the heart of a beast be given to it, and let 7 times pass over it. By the decree of watchers the thing is, and by the saying of the holy ones the request is, to the intent that people living may know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that to the one to whom he wants to, he gives it, and he sets up over it even the lowliest one of mankind. This was the dream that I myself, King Nebuchadnezzar, beheld, and you yourself, O Belshazzar, referring to Daniel, say what the interpretation is, for as much as all the other wise men of my kingdom are unable to make known to me the interpretation itself, but you are competent, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you, right? Because we know, Deuteronomy 32:8, Dead Sea Scrolls, the sons of God were given the nations as an inheritance. And that's why you have the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece. You had a prince of Babylon, but even that prince couldn't tell the dream to Nebuchadnezzar through their magic practicing priests. It took a captive of Israel, the nation that was overseen by Michael, whom allowed his people to be taken captive by Babylon because they needed to be punished for disobeying Jehovah, Michael's God, the one who sent that angel to lead the people through to the promised land and then oversee them as his body was being developed. It took Daniel, one of Michael's people, to interpret this dream for the king of Babylon. And so the king of Babylon is recognizing this in Belteshazzar, Daniel. Verse 19, at that time Daniel himself, whose name is Belteshazzar, was astonished for a moment, and his very thoughts began to frighten him. The king was answering, saying, O Belteshazzar, do not let the dream and the interpretation themselves frighten you. Belteshazzar was answering and saying, O my lord, may the dream apply to those hating you, and its interpretation to your adversaries. Although that's not what ended up happening. The tree that you beheld, that grew great and became strong, and the height of which finally reached the heavens, and was visible to all the earth, and the foliage of which was fair, and the fruit of which was abundant, and on which there was food for all, under which the beasts of the field would dwell, and on the boughs of which the birds of the heaven would reside. It is you, O king, because you have grown great and become strong, and your grandeur has grown great and reached the heavens, and your rulership to the extremity of the earth. And because the king beheld a watcher, even a holy one, coming down from the heavens, who was also saying, chop down the tree and ruin it, however leave its rootstock itself in the earth, but with a banding of iron and copper among the grass of the field, with the dew of the heavens let it become wet, and with the beasts of the field let its portion be, until 7 times pass over it. It is you, O king. That tree, the tree you beheld, is you, O king. 7 times are going to pass over the tree, which is the king of Babylon. This is the interpretation, O king, and the decree of the Most High is that which must befall my lord the king of Babylon. And they will be driven away from men, and with the beasts of the field your dwelling will come to be. And the vegetation is what they will give even you to eat, just like the bulls, and with the dew of the heavens you yourself will be getting wet. And 7 times themselves will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdoms of mankind, and that to the one he wants, he gives it. The king of Babylon had become arrogant, even though he was allowed to take God's people captive, because they had become arrogant. And that was not to be tolerated while they were the ones being used to bring forth the seed, the Messiah who would come. The king of Babylon is who's being talked about here. Not just someone, not anyone else but this king. And because they said to leave the rootstock of the tree, your kingdom will be sure to you after you know that the heavens are ruling. Watchtower supporters, it's the king of Babylon and his kingdom being chopped down. Who is the tree? You, O king. And 7 times are going to pass over you until you understand it's the Most High who is the king. And he's letting you rule. And you're acting a fool. And so a fool is who you will be. Until you understand it's the heavens ruling. It's not the prince, the son of God, who's given you this kingdom because Michael has been allowed to let these people be taken captive. No, it's nothing like that at all. It's the heavens deciding these things. Therefore, O king, may my counsel seem good to you, and remove your own sins by righteousness and your iniquity by showing mercy to the poor ones. Maybe there will occur a lengthening of your prosperity. All this befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. What does all this include, Watchtower supporters? 7 times passing over it. The tree that is the king. All this befell the king. All of it. As he acted like a beast for 7 times. It doesn't say 7 times are 2,520 years. It doesn't say anything but that 7 times are likely 7 years, which is what both Yom and Idan usually mean. Again, unless they're qualified, like in Numbers 14 or Ezra 4:6, as a day for a year. But it does not say this here. This is one of your fatal flaws, Watchtower supporters and Watchtower Society. You took a text or an understanding from 2 texts and you said, oh, that must also be true here. One problem. Actually, a lot of problems. But the problem here is that it doesn't say that. You took authority that you didn't have to interpret 7 times which is typically 7 years, being applied entirely. All this, the 7 times, all of it. The tree being chopped down, all of it. The banding of iron and copper, all of it, befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. You took something from other texts that have nothing to do with this king, and you applied a day for a year, and you expanded this 7 times that all befell this king here, and you took us all the way from 607 to 1914. You had no authority to do that here. Let's read on. At the end of 12 lunar months, he happened to be walking on the royal palace of Babylon. The king was answering, saying, "Is this not Babylon the Great, that I myself built for the royal house with the strength of my might and for the dignity of my majesty?" While the word was yet in the king's mouth, there was a voice that fell from the heavens. To you it is being said, Watchtower supporters, Watchtower Society, to you it is being said, O Nebuchadnezzar the king, the kingdom itself has gone away from you. And from mankind they are driving even you away. With the beasts of the field your dwelling will be. Vegetation they will give even you to eat like the bulls. And 7 times themselves will what? Watchtower supporters and Watchtower Society, pass over this king of Babylon. Pass over you until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and to the one he wants to, he gives it. This is a message and a prophecy for the king of Babylon, who is arrogantly acting while God's people, Michael's people, are at Babylon. These 7 times befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. At that moment, the word itself was fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and from mankind he was being driven away, and vegetation he began to eat like bulls, and with the dew of the heavens his own body got to be wet, until his very hair grew long, just like the eagles, and his nails like the birds. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up to the heavens my eyes, and my own understanding began to return to me. At the end of the days, 7 times. 7 years is likely what we're talking about here, Watchtower people. There's no day for a year here. There's no beyond the king of Babylon prophecy here. This all befell Nebuchadnezzar the king. And I blessed the Most High himself, and the one living to time indefinite I praised after he acted like a beast for being so arrogant. Because his rulership is a rulership to time indefinite, and his kingdom is for generation after generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are being considered as merely nothing, and he is doing according to his own will among the army of the heavens. Right? This has nothing to do with you, Nebuchadnezzar, and how great you think you are. The moment you start thinking of how great you are, and this applies to the Watchtower people and supporters who think they're so great because of who they think they are, once you start thinking like that, while the word is yet in your mouth, you're going to find out it is not like that. And that word's going to fall right out of your mouth, and it's going to be replaced with praise for the one who makes all things take place. And you will know that you are nothing, just like the king of Babylon was brought to in disgrace. It is Jehovah and those he appoints to do his will among the army of the heavens and the inhabitants of the earth, and there exists no one that can check his hand and that can say to him, "What have you been doing?" Don't you ever completely trust in humans, because you can check them. You should check them. Revelation 2:2. What are you doing? You can't do that to the Most High. At that same time, my understanding began to return to me, and for the dignity of my kingdom and my majesty and my brightness themselves began to return to me. And for even the most high royal officers and my grandees began eagerly searching. And I was reestablished upon my own kingdom, and greatness extraordinary was added to me. 7 times ended here, Watchtower supporters in society. They all ended right here, to show the king of Babylon who was really in charge here. This has nothing to do with 1914. It has nothing to do with the countdown from 607 to 1914. Even if we give you all the 70 years texts that we just reviewed, you have no basis for doing anything like you do next and counting down these 7 times as if they're a day for a year, which isn't mentioned one single time, yet you do it here. Why? You have no authority to do that here. It doesn't apply. It applies right here to the king of Babylon. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of heavens, because all his works are truth and his ways are justice. And because those who are walking in pride, he is able to humiliate. Stop walking in pride, Watchtower Society. Stop using these texts to glorify yourselves. You're going to be humbled until you do what Nebuchadnezzar had to do, and that is start praising the one who deserves it, not you. Not you. As regards, now we're getting to Nebuchadnezzar's son. Let's follow this a little bit forward. Verse 1, and as regards Belshazzar the king, he made a big feast for 1,000 of his grandees, and in front of the 1,000 he was drinking wine. Belshazzar, this is Nebuchadnezzar's son, under the influence of the wine, said to bring in the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken away from the temple that was in Jerusalem. Jehovah may let you take his people captive, but he's going to watch what you do. They're always watching. They're the watchers. Just like we saw that other watching and do. We're watching Nebuchadnezzar and his son right here. Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar started under the influence of wine to blaspheme Jehovah by taking the temple vessels, that from them the king and his grandness, his concubines, and his secondary wives might drink. At that time they brought in the vessels of gold that they had taken away from the temple of the house of God that was in Jerusalem, and from them the king, Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, but it relates, and his grandees and his concubines and his secondary wives drank. They drank wine. They praised the gods of gold and of silver, copper, iron, wood, and stone. Even though we just read how Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar's father, after becoming arrogant, had learned that very lesson not to do these things. Don't praise the wrong gods. Praise the King of heaven, even if you're a Babylonian king. As soon as they started doing that, Belshazzar and his wives and all those with him, at that moment, right, just like Nebuchadnezzar started to praise himself and Babylon the Great, right as that happened, the fingers of a man's hand came forth and were writing in front of the lampstand upon the plaster of the wall of the palace of the king. And the king was beholding the back of the hand that was writing. At that time, as regards the king, his very complexion was changed in him. He saw the writing on the wall. And his own thoughts began to frighten him. And his hip joints were loosening, and his very knees were knocking each other. The king was calling out loudly to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king was answering and saying to the wise men in Babylon, any man that will read this writing and show me its interpretation. With purple he will be clothed, with a necklace of gold about his neck, and as the third one in the kingdom he will rule. At that time all the wise men of the king were coming in, but they were not competent enough to read the writing itself, or to make known to the king the interpretation. Consequently, King Belshazzar was very much afraid, and his complexion was changing within him, and his grandees were perplexed. Right? He praised the gods, the prince of his kingdom, and look what happened next. It takes one of God's people, one of Michael's people, to come in and tell them what's happening, what's going to happen next. Consequently, King Belshazzar was very much afraid. His complexion changed. We read that. As regards the queen, because of the words of the king and his grandees, she entered right in to the banqueting hall. The queen answered and said, O king, keep living even to times indefinite. Do not let your thoughts frighten you, nor let your complexion be changed. Verse 11, there exists a capable man in your kingdom in whom there is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father that we just read, illumination and insight and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, set him up as chief of the magic practicing priests and conjurers and Chaldeans and astrologers, even your father, O king. For as much as an extraordinary spirit and knowledge and insight to interpret dreams and the explanation of riddles and the untying of knots had been found in him, in Daniel, whom the king himself named Belshazzar, now let Daniel himself be called, that he may show the very interpretation, just like he did before, about the 7 times relating to the king Nebuchadnezzar. And all of that being fulfilled in him. Nothing else was mentioned. Accordingly, Daniel himself was brought in before the king. We're going to read to verse 22. We're almost done. The king was speaking up and saying to Daniel, are you the Daniel that is of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Judah? I've also heard concerning you that the spirit of gods is in you, and illumination and insight and wisdom extraordinary have been found in you. And now there have been brought in before me the wise men and the conjurers, that they may read this very writing, even to make known to me its interpretation. But they are not competent enough to show the very interpretation of the word. And I myself have heard concerning you that you're able to furnish interpretations, to untie knots themselves. Now, if you are able to read the writing and to make known to me its very interpretation, with purple you will be clothed, with a necklace of gold around your neck, and the third one in the kingdom you will rule, as the third one in the kingdom. At that time Daniel was answering and saying before the king, let your gifts prove to be with you yourself, and your presents do you give to others. However, I shall read the writing itself to the king, and the interpretation I shall make known. Let's pay attention closely here. As for you, king, the Most High God himself gave to Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom and the greatness and the dignity and the majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples, national groups, and languages proved to be a quaking and showing fear before him. Whom he happened to want to, he was killing. And whom he happened to want to, he was striking. And whom he happened to want to, he was exalting. And whom he happened to want to, he was humiliating. But when his heart became haughty and his spirit became hard, so as to act presumptuously, he was brought down from the throne of his kingdom. This has nothing to do, and it had nothing to do, and as Daniel's telling Nebuchadnezzar's son, it has to do with the kingdom of Babylon, not Zedekiah being removed from the kingdom of Judah. And his own dignity was taken away from him. And from the sons of mankind he was driven away. His very heart was made like that of a beast. With the wild asses his dwelling was. Vegetation they would give him to eat, just like the bulls. And with the dew of the heavens, his own body got to be wet, until he knew the Most High God is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that to the one whom he wants to, he sets up over it. And as for you, his son Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. Did any of you get anything from what we just read involving the tree in Nebuchadnezzar's head that Daniel interpreted and made explicit to what happened to him? 7 times passed over him, and his kingdom was given back to him. And then when it started to happen to his son, Jehovah did the same thing to him and brought Daniel into him and told him, you knew all that happened to your father, and you did the same thing. So, here's what I'm going to do to you. But my point in reading to this point is to explain to all of you what is very clear in these texts. Is it not? There is no connection whatsoever between the 7 times of Daniel and the tree in the dream in his head, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and 607 BCE. There is no connection between the 7 times that all happened to him the tree is the king, and all of this, including the 7 times that we're passing over, happened to Nebuchadnezzar. They're not explained in any way as applying to anything or anyone else, nor are they interpreted or associated to anything else but Edan, which is a year usually. 7 years. Not 2,520 days that you then interpret as 2,520 years because of explicit applications of a day for a year in 2 totally different books and contexts. That's what the Watchtower Society has done. And that's why, everyone, it doesn't matter whether or not 607 is correct. It doesn't matter whether or not 70 years involves servitude or desolation of the land in the text that we reviewed. Without the 7 times of Daniel being interpreted as 2,520 years, counting down from 607 BCE, there's no 1914 anywhere. I'm sorry. There never was any connection between these 7 times and anything involving anyone or any kingdom but Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. They're wrong. Or if they're right, it has nothing to do with this account, right? There's some new light or something telling them something we can't see, that nobody can see, and doesn't even seem to be correct at all. So they have misinterpreted this account completely by not applying it the way the account applies it, and the interpretation given of the dream by Daniel. It's not like something we have to go figuring out. If the dream was all we had, maybe you could try to, even then, right? But Daniel explains it, Watchtower supporters and society. He tells you what it means right here. We just read it all. And then he goes on to explain to Nebuchadnezzar's son that that's what it meant. There is absolutely no basis for connecting these 7 times of Daniel, this tree, this chopping down, this kingdom, with the establishment of God's kingdom in 1914 or any other time other than in this king at this time who had become so arrogant that it was time that he understood who's ruling, no matter who seems to be ruling. So stop fooling with what we can all read as the meaning of these texts. They're pretty clear, I would say, in context. Now, let's go to our second main text. So we just read a significant context of Daniel 4:32, where it talks about these things and how Daniel 4:23 and the 7 times passing over this king so that he understood who's really ruling, and then he was given back his kingdom when those days were completed, right? When he had come to the end of those days passing over him, 2,520 days, 7 years, 7 times, he was given back the kingdom. It's not talking about the reestablishment of a kingdom or the tree growing again 2,520 years later. There's nothing here that shows that.